In last week's portion, we had read about how Yaakov was accused that he attempted to rape his mistress, his master's wife, and it was a false accusation, and he was thrown into a dungeon. He was there for 10 years in the dungeon. The last year of his incarceration, the wine steward and the baker, they were both ministers in the court of Paro. They were put there because it was a prison for the higher echelon of the government. And both of them were ministers. And Yosef, being who he was, he had a certain ability, a certain distinction. He was appointed by the ward to oversee the prison. He was given the charge that he should attend to all their personal needs. And both of them had a dream. The wine steward had a dream and the baker had a dream. And they were in a state of depression. And Yosef approaches them. He says, I see you people, you look down. What's going on? He said, we both had dreams and we don't know what it's all about. So Yosef says to them, there's no reason to be depressed. The ability to interpret dreams, it's the hand of God. Maybe I can help you with this. And he interprets the dreams. The dream of the wine steward was that in 3 days, he will be reinstated and he will be serving the goblet of wine to the king. And the baker, the interpretation of the dream was that in 3 days, he's going to be hanged and his remains are going to be displayed, and the birds, the vultures, will be picking the flesh off his body. And it happened 3 days later. Paro celebrated his birthday. The wine steward was reinstated. The baker was killed, and his body was displayed, and exactly as Yosef interpreted it to be. But after Yosef interpreted the dream of the wine steward, he says to the wine steward, since I've done you this favor and I accommodated you, I want you to do me a favor. I'm an innocent man. I was kidnapped. I come from a special family, and I was sold into slavery. Because of what I've given you the service, remember me and mention me, because when you leave this prison, you can be reinstated, you can be in a position to put in a good word for me, that I'm an innocent victim, and maybe I'll be released. That's the request he had made of the wine steward for the service that he had given him, that he interpreted his dream. The Torah tells us he was reinstated, he forgot about him, and it was dead and buried. The wine steward never considered addressing Yosef's request. Yosef spent another 2 years in prison, in this dungeon, before he was released. And that's the beginning of this parsha. It was at the end of 2 years, Paro begins dreaming. Now, the Medrash tells us when Yosef had asked the wine steward to remember him and mention him, he said 2 words, remember me and mention me. For each word, he spent another year in prison. Because making that request of this person was considered a lack of faith. And as a result of that, remember me is 1 year, mention me is a 2nd year. After the 2 years were up, he's ready to be released. And as a result of that, Paro begins dreaming. He has nobody to interpret the dreams. All of a sudden, the wine steward pipes up and he says, there was somebody in prison with us, and he has that ability. He's the one. And sure enough, Yosef comes out of prison, interprets the dreams, which we'll speak specifically about. And Paro sees that his interpretation is correct. And Yosef is elevated to viceroy of Egypt within moments. From the time he was pulled out of that dungeon and groomed and had a change of clothing, that day itself, Paro decided this man is going to be my viceroy. In a certain way, he was more powerful than Paro, because Paro understood that the only man who could save the day is only this person, to oversee all the financial ongoings of Egypt during this very tough time. It was there could be 7 years of famine, 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. And Yosef had a plan how to store away the produce of the plenty, to plan for the famine, so the country should not perish during the years of famine. That's basically the story. Now, there's a question which is asked. We know in life, although the Talmud tells us that one's yearly financial stipend is set from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, nevertheless, we have to take initiative to be able to earn what's allocated for us. You have to do some level of initiative. Take initiative. Things don't happen by themselves. It's only after we've taken all the initiative we could, then what's meant to be ours becomes ours. Yosef's in prison. He has an opportunity, maybe, to be released, because this man will have a level of beholdenness to him because of the service which he offered him, which he provided. So he took initiative. To sit back, it's going to happen by itself. It may not happen. So he took initiative. So if he took initiative, and that's the proper way to deal with issues, was he faulted? But yet he's faulted. For each word, he spent another year, which we'll discuss why exactly that is the consequence of that. So the Medrash tells us that what happens if a person, he's cold-hearted, ingrate, and you ask him to do you a favor. People told you up front, you're wasting your time. Like when you beat a dead horse, there's no life coming out of the horse. Asking this man to reciprocate, to appreciate what you did for him, you're wasting your time. As a result of that, that's not considered initiative. If there's a chance on a conventional level, you may have a response as one thing. This man is so cold-hearted, so non-giving, whatever you do for him, he has no level of appreciation. So if you ask this man to reciprocate, what is it considered? It's not initiative. It's not initiative, therefore it's a lack of faith. Now, there's an expression in English, it's called desperation. A person is drowning, and he sees straws floating on the surface of the ocean, and he grabs the straws to try to hold on to the straws. What's that called? It's called grasping for straws. Due to his desperate state, he grabs anything, but there's no way that straw can hold him up. But due to his desperation, he somehow deludes himself that maybe holding on to that straw, it's going to hold him up. Yosef was so desperate to get out of prison. He was already there 10 years. And all of a sudden, he has another years. He has another year. He doesn't know when he's getting out. Due to a state of desperation, although he knew rationally that this man will not reciprocate to any degree, but due to his desperation, it's like he grasped at straws. He believed this was initiative. It was not initiative. Because these people are naturally ingrates. And a person is an ingrate at that level, there will not be reciprocation. So why did you go to him? A Jew is never permitted to be desperate. Especially Yosef should not be desperate. He should always have the faith and the belief that God, when the time is meant to come, it's going to happen. And he will present the proper person maybe to bring it about. And if he didn't, and it's this person, he's definitely not the way to go, because this person is a pagan who has no relevance to what? To being appreciative or be beholden. That's the understanding. Now, why for each word he spent another year? Why the first 10 years? Why was he in the dungeon for 10 years? So we discussed this in the past. Now, who fathered the tribes of Israel? Yaakov. Right? The tribes of Israel are called Bnei Yisrael, the sons of Israel. Yaakov, he had two names, Yaakov, and after he had defeated the angel, he was given another name, Yisrael, Israel. We are the Bnei Yisrael. However, two of the tribes are not Bnei Yisrael. They're the sons of Yosef. Yosef, although he was a son and they were grandchildren, that classification was tribes. Ephraim and Menashe, although they're the sons of Yosef, not the sons of Yaakov, nevertheless, because of their exceptional status and spirituality, they were designated by Yaakov as tribes, although they're grandchildren. So the Midrash tells us in the Gemara that initially Yosef was meant to have 12 sons, and each son would have been a tribe, except when the wife of Potiphar, his master's wife, tried to seduce him. He became so overwhelmed, he lost 10 droplets of semen. For each droplet of semen that was lost, he lost a tribe. Each droplet of semen would have been a tribe. But because he lost those droplets went to waste, he only had two of the 12, but those 10 were lost forever. Okay? Now, there's a word from the Maharal of Prague. Maharal of Prague says a beautiful concept, a fundamental principle. How do you differentiate between the spiritual realm, and the physical realm? In the physical realm, you have cause and effect. You have something that exists, and due to being exposed to an environment, the environment, due to its influence, it impacts on whatever exists. For instance, I have a freshly baked loaf of bread, and you leave it exposed. Over time, that loaf will begin getting stale. Eventually, it'll become dry, and eventually it'll revert back to dust, turn into dust. That's a natural process which happens. Why? Because being exposed to a certain type of environment, the environment affects it that way. That's the concept. In the spiritual realm, anything that exists in spiritual, it's a constant, it remains at that level. Once it exists, nothing can affect it. It remains unaffected. Okay? Now, the Torah goes, Moshe Rabbeinu lived 120 years. Exactly. The day he was born, he passed away. 120 years after he passed away. The Torah goes to describe his physical state when he died. His vibrancy was the vibrancy of a young person. His eyesight was perfect. His strength was perfect. That's what the Torah tells us. Now the question is, why does the Torah have to give us a physical update on Moshe's physical condition? Not that he was the most humble person that ever walked the face of the earth. Not that he brought the Torah from heaven to earth for the Jewish people. That's important for us to know. But that when he was 120 years old, he was like a young man, that nothing waned. His power was strong. His eyesight was strong. His vibrancy was, why is that important for us to know? So the Maharal of Prague explains this principle. What is the proof that Moshe Rabbeinu lived a life, total life of spirituality? Because he was unaffected. Anything in the spiritual realm remains unaffected. Moshe remained affected, but he remained unaffected. That's to establish his reality. So what's the difference between physical and spiritual? Spiritual is unaffected. It affects, but it's not. It's unaffected. Physical is affected. Yosef was at a level. He was supposed to affect, not be affected. When the wife of Potiphar tried to seduce him, and she was a beautiful woman, and he had to restrain himself, but factually speaking, to what degree was he affected? In a negative sense, 10 droplets of semen. So the degree he was affected, 10 drops of semen, for each droplet he lost, 1 year in the dungeon. He spent the year being incarcerated. 10 drops of semen, 10 years of incarceration. Now, what is a slave? A slave is the chattel of a master. A slave, body and soul, is totally controlled by the master. The master dictates every aspect of that slave's life. So therefore, there's no more creature affected than a slave-master relationship. That's the ultimate. So because Yosef was affected to lose 10 drops of semen, that's the degree he was affected. For each year, for each droplet, he spent a year in the dungeon. He was incarcerated, meaning he had no control over himself. He was limited. After 10 years, he was meant to leave. But because, again, he was affected due to a state of desperation, and he asked of this man who was the ultimate ingrate, that there wasn't a chance that he was going to reciprocate, for each word, to what degree was he affected? Another 2 years. The words, 2 years. Therefore, you will be affected at the most extreme level, spending another 2 years in the dungeon, and therefore he spent 12 years in the dungeon. That was Yosef's predicament, due to what he was. Al explains, we find Moshe Rabbeinu in the 210th year of the Jews being in Egypt. Moshe is sent from Midian to be redeemer of the Jewish people. Okay? And he's given all kinds of signs to prove to the Jewish people that he's the redeemer. After he presents the miracles that he's the redeemer, what does it say? It says, and the people believed. In Hebrew, it's Vayamein Hom. The people believed. So the Maharal of Prague cites the Midrash. When they believed, it says, Miyad Poska Shibud. The moment they believed that Moshe is the Redeemer, that there's a monotheistic being, and he's representing that being, the bondage ceased at that moment. Question is, what does one thing have to do with another? Because they believed, therefore the bondage ceased. Believing the monotheistic being, what does that mean? You live in an environment, you're a slave, your masters are pagans. The environment is pagan. We're holding at the 49th level of spiritual contamination. How could you believe? Believe is what? Something you should be affected. And based on being affected, you should be a pagan, no matter what happens. They were able to shirk that and remain unaffected. Despite all the Egyptians are pagans, we believe that Moshe is the Redeemer representing the monotheistic God. As a result of that, once you take on a profile of unaffected, you can't be a slave any longer. As a result of that, the moment it says they believed, Miyad Poska Shibud, the bondage ceased at that moment, instantaneously. What's a different story? There's some person I know today, he's in his early 80s. He visited a location in so-called Rechasim. This is in the 60s. And there's a very holy rabbi there. He was the dean of men in this yeshiva, and his name was Eli Lapian. And he asked this young man, he was about 21 at the time, what does God want from you? Does he want you that you should do what you want to do, or he wants you to do what you don't want to do? That's the question he asked this young man. He was 21 at the time. So he said, I heard it straight from this person himself. He said to this great rabbi, this holy rabbi, he says, God wants us to do what we want to do. He says, no, God wants you to do not what you want to do. What are we inclined for? We're inclined for material. God wants you to go against the grain. Against the grain. That's choice. You have two types of food. More expensive, less expensive. More expensive food is kosher. Meets the kosher standard. The less expensive food is not. You're inclined to take a quality the same, to take what's less expensive. But despite that, because you're bound to the laws of dietary laws, you take the more expensive one. So that's going against the grain. Society says you get the best deal you could get. The best deal is what? Is going with the flow, with the grain. So therefore, when we make choices, the choice is always to do what we don't want to do, not what we want to do. When you want to do, that's physicality. That's the world. Whenever we make a choice not to do what we don't want to do, that's assuming a spiritual profile. Because why am I doing what I don't want to do? You know why? Because God says that's what you have to do. So that means you're assuming a profile of being unaffected. You're not allowing to be affected by your desires. You're not going to allow yourself to be affected by the perspective of humanity. You know, Eat to your heart's desire. Do what you could do, no matter what. Don't be concerned about government. No, we say no. You do what's right. You don't do what's wrong. But what's right is so difficult. Have to go against the grain. It's okay, but when you go against the grain, what profile are you assuming? At a spiritual profile. When you assume a spiritual profile, you have a different capacity to process things. Because now the capacity, the context of processing is within a spiritual profile, not within a physical profile. Finally, Paro needs interpretation of his dreams. Finally, the wine steward pipes up. He said, because all the soothsayers and all the sorcerers, they weren't able to interpret the dream to be satisfactory to Paro. So finally, when the wine steward realizes, nobody says, there was somebody in prison with us. He was a fool. This is the way he depicts him. He was a fool. He's a refugee, doesn't even speak our language, and he was a slave. And he has the ability to interpret dreams, and he interpreted my dream and the baker's dream. And it happened exactly as he said. I was reinstated, and he was hanged. The moment he hears that, immediately he summons Yosef from the pit, from the dungeon, has him groomed, give him a change of clothing. He's standing before Paro. Within no time, he becomes the viceroy of Egypt. Okay, now, why did the wine steward depict him in the most disgraceful, denigrating way? He's unstable. He doesn't even speak our language. He's a slave. Why did he depict him so negatively? The answer is, the wine steward should have addressed Yosef's request immediately. He delayed 2 years. That means Yosef is rotting in prison for 2 years because the wine steward is a bad guy. The wine steward is able to evaluate Yosef's persona. This man has the potential to go straight to the top if he's left out of prison. He's let out of prison. What will he do the first thing when he's released from prison? He's take a pound of flesh. Because he'll say, I've been in prison for 2 years because this man was an ingrate. Once I'm out and I'm in the position of power, the first thing I do is take him out. I will kill him for the suffering, the undeserving suffering that I suffered for 2 years. As a result of that, by putting him in a context of unqualified, unworthy, in every sense of the word, he was really protecting himself. That's what he's doing. But yet, the wine steward is depicted as a Rasha. The Rashoim, even when they do the right thing, they can't do it right. Because you see the way he depicted Yosef. What do you mean? He did it right. He did it right for himself. Because if he would have depicted him differently, he himself would be going to the gallows the moment Yosef becomes the king or the viceroy. So what's Chazal telling us? We see from here that even when a Rasha, when he does the right thing, he doesn't do it in a complete way. It's lacking in quality. It's not quality. That's the question I asked. The moment Yosef comes and interprets the dreams, and Paro says this is the right understanding. What does Yosef do? He says there's going to be 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine, and immediately gives him a solution. Paro could have said, just keep quiet. I don't want to hear from you. But Yosef was smart. He understood that unless he shows Paro that he's much more than a savant, that he has the ability to interpret dreams, he will not appreciate who he is. So he got it right under the wire. He can give Paro a chance. What takes years and hundreds of millions of dollars to figure out why the tsetse fly exists in Africa, not the United States. Yosef, with a second, he underwrote, he created a profile of finance, a financial profile. How to save the country. How Egypt will be the wealthiest civilization in the world. Within minutes. What did Paro say? I've never seen anybody like this in my life. This is divine genius. Yosef knew unless he strikes at that moment, he's locked into the profile that the wine steward had created for Paro's mindset. He's unstable. He doesn't speak our language. He's a slave. When he saw Yosef in real time, he never saw a human being like this, with the capacity and the capability. He was blown away. When he realized that the only saving factor for the country is him, he immediately appointed him to be the viceroy. So almost everything fell away. This man is no savant. I'll give you an example. Person's illiterate. And you could read, but the man he has a second grade education. He could read. The other man doesn't even have that. And he says, by the way, could you read this sentence? He reads it. They have a second grade education. He says, oh, you must be a genius. You must be a genius that you're able to read. I can't read. He's a genius. If you understand what the limitation of his knowledge, you understand he's only is able to read a few words. Doesn't mean he's a genius. That's the way the wine steward depicted Yosef. He has this ability. Outside of that, he's a zero. And the wine steward wanted Paro to be locked into that perception. Yosef broke out of that. Because the wine steward knew that if he let Yosef soar in his mind, his life is over. So he would do whatever he can to put a limitation on that. It didn't help because Yosef understood exactly what the wine steward said, because he knew exactly the way the Russia processes things. Therefore, he had to counter that by immediately offering a solution. Okay, I think we're going to stop here today, and we'll continue tomorrow.
Very nice.
Tomorrow, Larry's regular schedule.
You're still recording, Rabbi. I have a question.
I know, I'm shutting it off.
Just a quick question, Rabbi, because I was so interested. The reason that the wine steward felt that his life would be over, specifically what happened in that, because I'm asking that if a person spent 10 years, if one was in a cell, and there were 3 cells, and the person was in the middle cell, and on the left was Lavdil, Nelson Mandela, on the right was Kaczynski the bomber, you'd certainly recognize which one was more spiritual. So why didn't the wine steward see the specialness of Yosef as opposed to being threatened by him? What was the issue there?
Because he was the evil man. Evil man doesn't appreciate what holiness is.
I see. So his wiring is such that he's always looking for the bad to justify the bad.
No, because that's who he is. That's who he is.
I got it. By the way, we're recording again, Rabbi. I'm sorry. I don't think you shut it off.
It's okay. It was a good question. 1 second.